So happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new season of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, we have with us the witty and talented writer and broadcaster, an observer of the human condition, who took a walk on the wild side of politics, running for office in a riding he couldn't possibly win. He had spent a good part of his youth living in London, and when he came back to Canada, I think he felt both at home and also troubled by the country that he felt was having a bit of an identity crisis. Yes, Noah Richler, his father is the famous author Mordecai Richler, but Noah is a writer, an observer in his own right. He is often politically incorrect and says what he means at a time when that, of course, is frowned upon by the wokeness that has grabbed hold of free thought and free speech. Noah lives between Toronto and Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia, and I think you're joining us from Toronto today. Is that right?
Yes, I am, and thank you for having me, Senator.
Oh, it's great. Yes, Happy New Year, and please call me Pamela because we've known each other for quite some time. We talk a lot of politics on this podcast, and before we engage in all the contemporary issues that we want to talk about, I want to go back to 2015, the election then. You decided, in my mind, inexplicably, to run for office and for the NDP in a riding held firmly by the Liberals. What were you thinking?
Well, I was disturbed in the direction the country was persisting with, let's say. I'm not the sort of person who votes for a particular party for life. I actually believe that it's a good thing for a government to change hands periodically so that our parties that aren't in power don't go to seed. And I felt that Prime Minister Harper's time was effectively should have been up. I didn't like what a lot of his ministers were doing and saying. And though we may not agree on that, we'd probably agree that in the riding that I did choose of Toronto St. Paul's, it was high time that then Minister of, I'm not sure Carolyn Bennett stepped aside. Of course, that didn't happen. I only helped further her career and add to her pension. But I thought it was also important that someone like myself, who typically has reached an audience through writing that may not have appeared political in spirit, but was, try and reach a different audience and act. So sincerely, I ran wanting to win office. You can't actually do it otherwise. And failed. It wasn't the NDP's time, effectively.
But did you know that you had a snowball's chance in hell, really? An NDP candidate running against a long-standing Liberal seat with no money, and you had no experience?
Well, one of the small pleasures was that historically the NDP had raised no money, and I raised lots. I had to figure out how to ask for money and why it would be rational for a person to give a candidate likely to lose money, and decided that if democracy is to function, then it needs an argument. And believed that. And it became much easier to ask for money once I'd sorted out why I might do so myself. So we actually raised quite a bit of money. But in terms of actual winning, you can't be part of a team and lead it in bad faith. And the only good faith solution is to imagine that somehow, possibly, you might win, which is not actually absurd in Canada. I have to point out there's construction going on in the apartment upstairs. So let's just think this is the noise of life.
All right, it's just background noise. That's it.
Yeah. As I said, it's not absurd. And in fact, the Ontario MPP did actually win that riding after, I like to think, some of the groundwork that I did.
Yeah.
But in Canada, where our parliamentary system is fundamentally flawed, in that I believe party leaders have far too much power, and particularly the power to sort of choose or deny a candidate the ability to run, we end up voting effectively for a party leader in a presidential manner rather than for the local MP. So had Tom Mulcair, whom I respected enormously, actually had more sway, then who knows? Perhaps we might have got in, but that didn't happen.
You captured all this. Of course, you wrote about it, and you called the book "The Candidate" and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. But you've
Which was a self-conscious homage to Hunter
yes,
Thompson.
to Hunter Thompson for sure. But you actually had called up Chrystia Freeland, now the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, another journalist, another political novice, and said, "So what do we do here?" Was she helpful?
Yes, we met. I think she's a smart person and clearly being groomed to succeed Trudeau, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know these things, but the impression is that there's a great appetite for her to take over. I think that's also obvious in that the two killing portfolios of either health or Indigenous affairs, however it's titled, are posts she's not yet been handed. And I think that helps keep her record, the minister's record, clean. We had a conversation. I did not know her beyond being an acquaintance, but was alarmed in the way that she then spoke of Prime Minister Trudeau, then not yet Prime Minister, and his brand, which wasn't the way I naively thought politics should work. And I was the loser in that because Mulcair's brand failed. And I want to point out, just if I may, to allow people to remember that there are all sorts of reasons that the NDP wasn't going to win. And I think Canadians actually just wanted a complete breath of fresh air. And I constantly think of it in a way, Mulcair and Prime Minister Harper, who were sort of alike in some ways, kind of wrestling themselves to the floor of the forest, and then Trudeau kind of waltzing in, playing the lyre. That is Lyre, not Liar. But and winning. But Mulcair, let's remember, stumbled first of all because he upheld the right of women to wear a hijab in the ceremonial aspect of a citizenship ceremony. In other words, and was reviled in Quebec especially for that. I think it's worth remembering that in the light of Quebec's Bill 21 and Bill 97.
What happened recently with the young teacher who lost out?
And I think all the major parties and leaders behaved disgracefully in the last election by kowtowing to the Bloc Québécois Yves Blanchet, and even Jagmeet Singh, leading the party I ran for, telling folk that Bill 21 was merely symbolic. Well, that's never true. And the symbolic in politics has terrific import. And now we see, and lest someone decide that I'm branding the whole province racist, which I'm not, as Gore Vidal said of his homosexuality, then there's no such thing as a homosexual. There are only homosexual acts. Well, we might say there's no such thing as a racist, but there are racist acts. And I think that the Bill 21 is a racist act. Yeah.
And Sachi Curl in the debate got into a lot of trouble for having all of that. But when you raise
people were, I think it's worth dwelling on, but I mean, the parties are so craven for the block of votes that is Quebec.
Yeah.
I look forward to, and I think we're in a really difficult position because a majority is very difficult for rival parties or even the Liberals themselves to achieve. And one of my little fantasies is that the Conservatives in a minority government might ally with the NDP to bring in some form of proportional representation, which I think is possibly one of the better ways for our federal government to proceed. So in fact, there is better national representation rather than our being hostage to a particularly powerful lobby.
I mean, I don't think it'll ever happen. People love the idea of proportional representation when they're out of power and then find a million reasons never to implement it once in.
Well, I think the Conservatives
including the current group.
But I think the Conservatives might look at Quebec and think, you know what, the way to emasculate this unwieldy power is in fact to bring in some form of PR. But, I only deal in political fantasies.
Yes, no, that's right. And like running against in a seat that you couldn't win. You talked about brand and of course, celebrity politicians, that it is the era we're in, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump. They had the same MO, if you will, in terms of being out there, being on Twitter, having their brand, the way they connected with people. Even the conservatives here will concede that Justin Trudeau was the most difficult opponent in that race in 2015 because he was a celebrity. He had a name, he had a brand, he had his socks, he was the long hair, the this and that it isn't about, and I think you found this in the process too, that politics is not about being the smartest guy in the room, it's about being the most sellable.
Well, to do now Prime Minister Trudeau justice, I don't think that's entirely true, though. Then Chrystia Freeland spoke to me of the brand. I think there are other serious reasons why the Liberals won power. And one of them was that Canadians were tired of being governed by a party that appeared not to like them. There was the Conservatives had devolved into a manner of government in which that somehow they always seemed impatient and almost to dislike their constituency, which is
Stephen Harper was not warm and fuzzy. That's true.
No, and but smart he was, and I always wanted to have a conversation with him, never been able to. But so the Sunny Ways was basically presenting Canadians with a sense of relief that because there are really two forces in politics, or ways in which politicians win. One is for citizens to imagine that somehow they will be better for basking in the reflected light of the politician. Mm-hmm. And the other might be a more resentful tide, which is one of feeling excluded and wanting access. I think we should be very mindful of that. I think it's very important to be genuine about the representation of views, even when they're contrary, because otherwise we contribute to an augmentation of that resentment, which is a very sour political force. But what the Liberals were presenting with, and I speak about this in the book, and I hope a fairly jaunty way, but the in their sheer beauty, is sort of look at us, and these golden beams of light will make you better because you can be like us, and then the people realize that's not true.
Right, of course, and when you're rare in the political world in the sense of giving the other guy a break or saying, I may not have voted with him or even like him, but he was smart and he had an approach, or vice versa, however that works. But we are in a time now where everybody is somebody else's enemy. Just even in the last few weeks of the parliamentary session, we heard about all of the evils of white privilege and white supremacy, and this has become now common language. A year ago, 2 years ago, if you'd gone through the records, you would not have found references, as many as there are, to white privilege, white supremacy, and racialized Canadians and issues, and the focus on it is getting very confrontational.
Yeah, very divisive. Earlier you mentioned my return to Canada, and you suggested that I felt troubled coming back. That wasn't true, because in fact I felt enchanted by Canada when I came back.
At first.
Yes, I felt that I didn't know it. And I had all these very optimistic and empathetic ideas. I felt that in Canada we learned citizenship through basically understanding that it's kind of impossible to live on the territory without considering how someone else lives, that we had graduated from thinking as, let's say, the settlers and immigrants, of thinking of this place as vast and empty and hostile, to realizing that Canada was vast and inhabited. We're an odd country in that we're basically fantastically impracticable, and it's almost impossible to be Canada without some form of government managing, just distribution and how to meet. So we always actually need the other person. We can't quite be as solipsistically independent as many Americans manage themselves to be.
Yeah.
So I thought that a kind of spirit of cooperation, of imagining how another person lived, which I compared to the novel and how we read a novel and the lessons we get out of one, I thought that was part of being Canadian. Now I'm not sure if that is true. I sense that I will write about this again one day, but we've been encouraged by extraneous but also homegrown forces to think of ourselves in very restrictive ways. And on the one hand, I think we've made terrific advances in social justice, call it. More work in the apartment upstairs. But, I was sitting in a bar the other day, or a restaurant, very close to one of the major hospitals here in Toronto. I had just had my booster jab, and it was totally evident to me that about 80% of the medical staff of doctors and nurses were not white and advancing in class. And I found myself thinking about the Communist International, which is not to say that I'm a communist, but that, early on, après Marx, the communists understood or believed that there are ways in which the common interests of the poor were being hidden from them through nationalism in particular, and the wars were therefore pointless and a construct of self-interested upper classes. And though, as I say, there have been tremendous advances in social justice on the one hand, I do believe that identity politics are preventing us from understanding our common interests. And this makes me worry about Canada a lot. And I think about this a great deal. I read about this a great deal. This very good book called The Sum of Us, whose African-American author's name I forget for the moment, I apologize, but which points out that gains made on the racialized fronts benefit everybody, including whites, and the white poor in particular. And if the white poor realize this, and black poor as well, then we can actually make real societal advances.
So is this kind of a stage we have to go through where we've got racial rage, and then, I think somebody called it the white lash instead of the backlash, that we've got to go through that before we emerge again and see that there might be some common interests?
Well, I would imagine so. I mean, a lot of this is also generational. It's about time that someone like myself and my views got a certain comeuppance. And I do find myself wondering what will be the comeuppance of folk who are so keen to bring others down. I'm sure someone will take this literally and quote me somewhat out of context, but I remember having a discussion with a Polish-Canadian friend of mine and asking, what is going to happen to this generation to shunt them aside? And she said to me in a fairly thick Polish accent, a good war. Now, I don't want a good war, but I do understand the point she was making. And funnily enough, it was made at the beginning of COVID that we're still boringly living through. There was a short period of a month, maybe two, in which, and it was actually quite touching, the purpose of government was understood. And
that's exactly right, yeah.
The Quebec activists, Albertan activists, BIPOC activists, everything sort of fell aside because we had a joint endeavor, and that was to survive. And we had this overarching body that suddenly had a relevance, and that was government. A couple of months afterwards, COVID merely became another lens through which to amplify whatever were people's concerns. So the same columnists who've been railing against Trump or decrying the system as it exists just did so with through COVID. So
No, and it
it
became
is possible
so
that we get over
completely.
these questions, but I don't. So I don't know what is, and I hope something will unify us, because it's very alarming the degree to which these divisions have taken place, even territorially. We now operate almost as a dozen different countries within the territory called Canada, with Atlantic provinces shutting down, with Alberta being isolated in the imaginations of people outside the province. And there seems to be, and border controls. And I understand their necessity, but I lament the ways in which they support a kind of, I was going to say provincialism, but parochialism within the country.
Yeah,
and it's become so easy to resent the other.
you wrote a little bit about this whole idea. It was Sarah, your wife's cousin, a lawyer who contracted COVID-19
Yes.
and went through the whole ICU experience. And he said COVID was hard. It's not that COVID was hard. It's that the world that I came back to was.
Yes, he's a great, fantastically irreverent person, but he gets to say that because he spent, I think, about 47, 49 days, intubated, and it was very serious for him. And I'm sorry that one of the great casualties of COVID has been a little sense of humor. Ali Hassan still has it, and my friend, my wife's cousin Ron has it. But yes, we have become a world in which is, and this is extraordinary. I think a lot about the sort of psychological effects for the community, but all our relationships now begin with a state of wariness. Every single social transaction we have happens subsequent to decisions that are made about the potential and true toxicity of the meeting. And that's very worrying. I also, have experienced COVID both in rural and urban areas, and the two experiences are markedly different. And it's very easy in a smaller village that does not have much interaction with the world in ordinary circumstances to become incredibly wary and judgmental of the other. And I'm sorry about that. I worry for the ordinary human experiences that COVID has suppressed. And I'm actually surprised that there has been as little resistance to the various restrictions and lockdown orders that we've been.
So am I, because we're seeing quite the opposite in other countries. I mean, people saying enough, I will not live like this, and I will not have government determine my decisions about health. I mean, I'm not talking about anti-vaxxers. I'm talking about people who are saying, I don't want that much government in my life.
Well, I'd sort of imagined speakeasies, operating again in Toronto, where you could secretly squirrel away and drink till 3 a.m. with people without masks and so on, which is not me speaking as an anti-vaxxer. Again,
no, exactly.
Psychologically, I think this is really interesting. I remember one of the first things I had to do in order to be able to run for office was gather, I think it's 100 signatures from people in the community in which I was intending to run in the riding, saying that they approved of my throwing my hat into the ring, that they understood that it would be good for democratic practice. So I would go to the door and explain, this is not a vote. You're not voting for me as a dipper. You're basically just saying you understand that it's a good idea that we have a few candidates. And I think the resistance to that was greater than anything I that subsequently met canvassing for an actual vote. And I realized that a lot of the people I was speaking to were just exercising their freedom to say no. That basically, a lot of people, we can talk about government overreach, we can talk about science, but a lot of people are, I think, and we really need to pay attention to this in politics. This is part of that second, that alternate way of getting to power. I spoke of the people who feel excluded. A lot of people feel, and for good reason, that they have no real government over their own lives, and that decisions are being made for them all the time, and they're effectively powerless. And as I think in Mahogany, Brecht and Weil, there's a great song where I think is it Jenny, who talks of at the end her right to say no, and that's what I was encountering, or thinking that I was encountering. A lot of people who were actually exercising a political freedom, one of the few that they had left, and that was to say no to something, even if it was irrational to do so. And
don't knock on my door and don't come here, and I don't care.
It wasn't even that. No, it was actually a more democratic practice, that they were actually saying, "This is my choice to make, and I choose to say no."
Yeah.
And so it's really important. Like, societies function on trust and a sense of security. And the more people feel insecure, whether you feel insecure because you're Indigenous, Black, or simply poor, the more people will make choices that seem to be irrational and negative. And they're doing that because they have lost trust. That should alarm us.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Now, you've talked a couple of times about, whether people will misinterpret or misunderstand what you've said or deliberately take it out of context. And this is also the world we're living in, both in terms of journalism and in terms of writing in general, that this brave new world defined by political correctness and censorship and canceling people and wokeness, and that's not even to mention Twitter. What's your thinking on that at this point? Is this a phase? Are we going to come out of it? Is this the future because nobody really cares about free speech anymore? Where are we?
Again, and it was a fantastically educating experience running. I was very moved by it afterwards. And I bring that up because I think the population pretty well ends up doing the right thing. And most of the decisions that are made voting are the right ones. And I think that analogously, eventually we will build into the way we receive our news a kind of multiplier that says, this bit of news being thrown at me is far too amplified, and I'll damp it down. It's actually less true than it's being made out to be. And we'll learn to cope with the extraordinary amplification of the internet and news as it's presented to us. I also think there's an aspect of, call it the emperor's microphone rather than the emperor's clothes, and that eventually someone will just stand up and say, you know what, enough. Even when I got into trouble when tweets of mine were dug up, and this was actually confirmed by two people, by the Liberal Party doing their so-called upper research and basically taking tweets out of context in order to bring my campaign down because I had a fairly successful video campaign. I had suggested to my party, look, why don't I just write a column for the paper? They'll print it saying, sorry, I'm not saying sorry. And that will become the story, and we'll put an end to this, foraging around for a quote that can be manipulated against me. But they were too scared to let me do that, and I respected the order, so I didn't. But I think that will start to happen because the way we're operating now will become preposterous. And folk across the political panoply will realize, for instance, that so-called fake news is not just a property of, call it the right, but that we all indulge in it. CBC is fantastically non-representative in its ideological campaign to ensure its own survival. So that it, we couldn't hear enough about Afghanistan under Harper, and then all stories of the military disappeared, which I think is
unless you get to the part where you've got bad actors, and 30 years ago they were at a party and got drunk and engaged in some kind of sexual assault. I mean, those stories make the news, but not whether or not we are bringing home the Afghans to whom we owe much. Because
I think there are 19,000. Sorry, Senator, but I think if there are 19,000 complaints made about sexual harassment, we can't dismiss it quite.
No. I agree, but that has been only the next story after Afghanistan. I was thinking more that as I say, it couldn't send Don Cherry to enough places for as long as the Conservatives were in power, and now it's become. It imagines itself to be at the forefront of certain essential tasks for the country, like
proper procedure in COVID, and also championing, as it has the possibility of doing, because it's far too powerful a gatekeeper as it is, but furthering the interests of what it regards as press communities.
But what do we do in a world where we've got, I mean, Twitter was supposed to be this democratizing tool, and now it's being used by very powerful elites on all sides to ban those that disagree with them. I mean, Twitter helped invent Barack Obama, but it also helped invent Donald Trump, and then it killed him. Right?
Well,
it was banned.
I kind of feel that all news organizations should be, of course, I can't say should, and it would never happen again. We're dealing with fantasies, prohibited from actually looking at Twitter to kind of source their news. And instead, they might have a Twitter correspondent. So you understand in the 5 minutes of Metro Morning that is allotted to the absurd world that is the Twitterverse, that these are reports from a foreign country, rather than Twitter becoming, as it is inordinately, a tool for the lazy researcher. And so in which you again.
When reporters say they mean stuff they read on Twitter.
yeah. So that needs to be made clear and allotted a particular space.
So beyond the world of journalism, and that there's so many things wrong with the business today, and I'm totally sympathetic to the fact that their technology is out of date, and so there's a certain desperation, and they're taking funding from government, which is probably troubling. But how far does that go into your world, into the culture world and writing? I mean, are you, you're not the daily journalist, you're the observer. Is it impacting you too? Is that world changing that
Definitely,
you have to be careful?
That sound in the background is my dog taking water, in case people are wondering what lapping.
We can't hear it, but that would be good. The dog is beautiful, I should also say too.
Well, I was thinking that earlier today, because I'm stunned that politicians and the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, could have been in any way surprised by inflation. I don't understand what else you're expecting when you print $500 billion that previously you did not have. And I think a lot of these benefits are being used to support people in activities that are not about to return. We're learning how much people weren't enjoying their working lives, and that's as they were. That's a good thing. But paying out, and we're also learning that if we are to have a minimum sort of living wage, it can't be paid in cash, because that just also contributes to inflation and also keeps people at home. We can provide goods, food, shelter, and all that, but we should be wary of just handing out cash. I bring this up because I think of all those people in hospitality industries who are profiting by a government paying them money as if their livelihoods are going to return in the manner that that preceded COVID. By comparison, the world of journalism in which I grew up and came of age and prospered has completely collapsed. And there are small things that we can address in Canada that aren't true elsewhere. I'll get to that. But journalists weren't being paid, a couple of $1,000 a month to sit at home imagining that they go back to newspapers. And instead of which, they either had to adapt how they reported through podcasts like this or whatever, or turn to other work. And so we're actually doing the economy a harm by stopping the transition. Relatively small constituency, I think, that is actually ironically or paradoxically not prospering in COVID. So, it's a kind of, I'm advocating for at least recognizing that whether or not we like it, in capitalism, there's a kind of creative destruction, and we're stopping that from occurring. Look at journalism, and there are some really good things that have happened. There are small papers. There's the Tyee online papers on the West Coast, and there's the Halifax Examiner in Nova Scotia that do very good journalism. I do, just because, in case anybody was wondering, I do think that the CBC needs to actually be killed and reinvented. One of the nasty habits of the CBC, ever insecure about its own survival, beyond the moralizing that passes for reporting most of the time, is that it sees successes in other spheres and appropriates them in a way that undermines the success outside the building. So, for instance, cbc.ca, the website, gets an extraordinary amount of resources and undermines other news outlets' ability to do the same thing.
In the private side,
There was a musical music festival called Field Trip in Toronto that was managed by small independent bands called, under the arts and crafts label predominantly. And the CBC saw the success of that and made their own music festival. The CBC sees the success of podcasts and with its extraordinary amount of resources makes its own and ignores the podcasts that occur elsewhere that it sees as rival. It will have a program that lazily takes the material of podcasts from mostly from America, because it's also cheap material, and does that.
Yeah.
So in my killing the CBC, another political fantasy, what I would do instead is make of it effectively a wire service. I don't want to kill the local reporting that it does, but I would have the CBC become a much smaller organization whose mandate is to cover news that is perhaps not economically viable to cover otherwise. Exactly. And that this stuff would be made available to any newspaper and online service that wanted them. And if they didn't take it in a week, the CBC could broadcast it on its own site. But why we continue to pay for CBC television, and as I say, to subsidize the way in which it does harm to the sector to which it belongs, stuns me.
And this is a long-standing issue. I mean, I worked at both CBC and CTV, but when you're in the private sector at CTV and you're competing against an organization that is out in the real world fighting you for ad dollars, and it has a $1.5 billion subsidy, it's kind of an uneven playing field. Yeah. And this has been going on for a long time.
And it's also really worth looking at the news that it decides not to cover. Yeah. I think it's actually doing harm.
So is that spilling over and into what you feel you can write with those kinds of attitudes and ideas and the problems that are existing in the journalism world? When you go to freelance your article to somebody, to some newspaper or some magazine, are you then subject to these rules of the political correctness, and your language is unfair? You're treading on areas that you shouldn't touch. It's too sensitive. What are you feeling there?
Well, what am I feeling? First of all, I have to make clear right away that I'm a problematic writer. My epitaph, when I get to that stage, will say he tried to write short. So, I have a hard time doing that. So that's one reason not to give me space. Though I'm still fortunate, folks still seem to trust me enough to do that from time to time. And it's a good thing that newspapers or online platforms are refreshed, because in Canada we have a problem of monopoly, or competition is hard to come by. It's, again, I think back to this vast territory and how, for instance, in the communications providers have more or less carved up the territory and operate like a cartel. Perhaps better to think of the sorts of things I would do. Sometimes I think of having a column saying jobs I would like or something. And were I to say run the CBC in its present form, well, I first of all put an end to certain things like CBC correspondents talking to themselves, going down the corridor, and putting another CBC worker on air, and I would have them
and thanking them profusely for their work. Yeah.
And I would also diminish the number of the hours of slots that people have. Why in this country with so many interesting voices do we still allot hours of time to particular folk on the CBC? Carve up those 2 and 3 hour programs and make 6 half-hour ones. Enjoy the word they say, like, enjoy the diversity that's out there, and actually make it a much busier, reflective place, of ourselves.
Well, when you are unleashed to reinvent the world, it's going to be a different place now, isn't it?
Oh yeah, but it's going to be honest and fun, and argumentative in a good way. I think as well. There's so many lessons we can glean from Canadian life, and in cities, you're butted up against each other, and you have to consider other people. It's too easy in Canada not to have to meet the other. And so we miss out on really productive forms of engagement a lot of the time.
And learning how to deal.
And that's actually amplified, as we know, by the internet. You go out and choose the people to comport with, who are most often like yourself. I'm going to stop that. Talk to a stranger.
Good advice. Noah, great to talk to you. And thanks for helping us kick off our brand new year. And with what we hope will continue to be good discussions with interesting ideas from really interesting folks. Thank you.
Can I get just one more pithily?
Sure.
As it's 2022.
Yes.
Do not disband the Houses of Parliament. Turn it into, it's a horrid Gothic building. Is a horrid Gothic tribute to the Westminster and, are being colonized by Britain. Let's get rid of it and make Parliament a traveling show and do 3 months in Calgary, 3 months in Halifax, 3 months in Yellowknife, and again, meet each other and learn how the other half lives. Cut down on the bill.
Before Christmas, we had a discussion here in the podcast with Steve McClellan. He's the retiring head of the Chamber of Commerce in Saskatchewan. And he thought that in the House of Commons, what we needed was more grandmothers, so that when MPs are behaving badly, the grandmothers are to take them by their ears, pull them out of the chamber, and put them in their corner. And he also wanted mandatory traveling so that we could meet the others. So you see, you've got
that's what my first book was, me saying, I've been out of the country for 20 years. I want to learn it again. I'm going to walk it and find out about it. And that's what we need. We need to get out there, and for Canadians to see government in operation federally, that's actually housed locally for a time, and for MPs to have to consider how people live, as I say, in Winnipeg or the North.
I think it's a great idea.
Okay, let's make it happen. Right, thank you for having me.
Happy New Year. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye. And thank you for being here for our first edition of No Nonsense in 2022.